The air in Curio and Coil, a second-hand store that smelled perpetually of forgotten dreams and decaying paper, clung to Elias Thorne like a shroud. Dust motes danced in the anemic shafts of sunlight, piercing the grime-coated window panes, illuminating shelves overflowing with the discarded husks of other people's lives. Elias, a man who preferred the company of shadows and the silent click of a shutter to human interaction, navigated the labyrinthine aisles with the practiced ease of a nocturnal creature in its familiar burrow. He wasn't searching for anything in particular, merely allowing the quiet despair of the place to wash over him, a morbid comfort in its shared melancholy. His own existence, reclusive and detached, echoed the forgotten relics surrounding him. Then he saw it, tucked away on a lower shelf beneath a stack of mildewed encyclopedias. A camera. Not a modern digital marvel, nor even a recognizable vintage model, but something ancient, almost primitive. Its dark, polished wood was smooth from countless unseen hands, the brass fittings tarnished green with age. It hummed, a low, almost imperceptible thrum that vibrated more in his bones than in his ears, a sound like a distant dying heart. It felt impossibly heavy, dense with history, or perhaps something far older. A strange compulsion, cold and insistent, urged him to pick it up. The leather strap, surprisingly supple, felt unnervingly warm against his palm. He lifted it, the weight anchoring him, pulling him deeper into the shop's oppressive silence. He noticed the film already loaded, a peculiar thick stock that felt like dried parchment, certo? Curious, he took the camera home, his small, solitary apartment a sanctuary of ordered chaos, filled with darkroom chemicals and the hushed scent of developing prints. Under the pale glow of his safe light, he carefully extracted the film. It was a single roll, exposed, waiting. He processed it with a meticulousness born of habit and a growing inexplicable dread, nay? The development swirled, the chemicals biting at the emulsion, and slowly, agonizingly, images began to surface, nay? They were static at first, like any old photographs, faded sepia tones depicting mundane scenes, a man tying his shoe on a cobbled street, a woman reaching for a book on a high shelf, a child laughing in a sun-dappled park. But as the prints dried, laid out on the counter, something subtly shifted, certo? Elias, accustomed to the stillness of captured moments, saw it first in the man's shoe. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor in his leg, a muscle clenching beneath the fabric of his trousers. He dismissed it as a trick of the light, or perhaps a flaw in the old film. He leaned closer, his breath fogging the print, and then, undeniably, the man's foot twitched. A single, unsettling spasm, a violent, involuntary jerk. The scene, previously frozen in time, now held a disturbing, latent energy. He snatched up another print, the woman reaching for the book, certo? Her fingers, delicate and still moments ago, now trembled, a faint but distinct tremor running up her arm. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. These weren't mere photographs, they were something else entirely, something alive and sickeningly resonant. The child in the park, mid-laugh, now had a tear, a single glistening drop forming in the corner of his eye, slowly, inexorably, beginning to track down his cheek, certo? The laughter, once joyous, seemed to curdle into a silent, premonitory sob. A chill, deeper than any winter draft, permeated his apartment. This antique camera, unearthed from the dusty heart of a forgotten store, did not merely capture light, it captured a horrifying, unfolding truth. Elias's mind, a fortress built on empirical observation and photographic precision, violently rejected the impossible. He meticulously re-examined the prints, holding them to the light, then to his magnifying loupe, certo? He sought flaws in the emulsion, aberrations in the developing fluid, any logical explanation for the unnatural animation, nah? Perhaps it was a trick of his own fatigued vision, a phantom movement born of sleepless nights spent hunched over a developing tray. He even considered the insidious creep of madness, a dark thought that whispered from the periphery of his consciousness, suggesting his solitude had finally curdled into delusion. He scoffed, a hollow, humorless sound, and began to systemically reprocess the film, convinced a subtle error had corrupted the images. Yet, with each fresh batch, the chilling phenomenon persisted, unfurling with an unnerving, deliberate slowness. Despite his determined efforts to rationalize, a cold dread began to seep into the foundations of his being. He developed more film from the camera, deliberately capturing mundane street scenes. A woman crossing a busy intersection, a flock of pigeons erupting from a fountain, a vendor arranging fruit at a market stall. Each print, initially static, soon began its horrifying, subtle dance of premonition. The woman's purse strap, at first still, would slowly fray, a single thread unraveling, then two, then three, hinting at a future snag, a fall. The pigeon's flight, captured in a freeze frame, would gradually distort, one wing bending at an unnatural angle, another feather detaching, foreshadowing a mid-air collision, eh? These were not mere photographs, they were living prophecies, an anathema to his orderly world, mocking his every attempt at scientific dismissal. A profound sense of paralysis settled over him. He found himself transfixed by the evolving horrors, a silent, unwilling spectator to tragedies yet to unfold. One print, in particular, haunted him. A seemingly innocuous image of a child on a playground swing, certo? Over hours, the swing's chain, initially taut, slowly began to twist, a single link straining, then elongating until a hairline fracture appeared, expanding with agonizing slowness. A visceral urge, a raw, primal scream of warning, threatened to erupt from his throat. He imagined rushing to that park, tearing the child from the swing, averting the inevitable. But the thought felt absurd, a grotesque fantasy. How could he explain? How could he intervene in a destiny revealed only through a cursed lens, nah? The sheer impossibility of it all, the terrifying weight of unsolicited knowledge, forced a retreat. He tucked the prints away, locking the camera in a darkened drawer, a desperate, futile attempt to sever his connection to the unfolding doom. This was not his burden, he desperately tried to convince himself. However, the world outside his apartment seemed to conspire against his denial, certo? A brief, unsettling encounter with Mrs. Albright, his elderly neighbor, exacerbated his unease. She appeared at his door, uninvited, bearing a plate of burnt cookies, her eyes, milky with age, seeming to pierce through his carefully constructed facade. "That old shop, Curio and Coil," she rasped, her voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. It always had a way of finding things that weren't meant to be found. She spoke of strange disappearances, of objects that seemed to cling to misfortune, of shadows that lengthened even at midday. Her words, delivered with chilling conviction, felt like a direct accusation, an oblique reference to the very camera he now possessed. He dismissed her as senile, yet her uninvited visit, her knowing gaze, chipped away at his resilience, planting insidious seeds of doubt about the camera's true provenance and its malevolent intent. The relentless psychological assault began to erode his once unshakable grip on reality. Sleep offered no respite, merely a new theater for the unfolding horror. His dreams were fractured, a kaleidoscope of twitching limbs, fraying ropes, and distorting faces, each image a grotesque echo of the photographs he desperately tried to forget, nah? He found himself jumping at shadows, interpreting every creak of his old building as a premonition, every distant siren as a confirmation of the camera's grim prophecies. His once ordered life became a chaotic landscape of paranoia. The boundaries between waking life and nightmare blurred, and the chilling whispers of dread, once faint, now resonated with the undeniable clarity of a death knell, signaling a profound and irreversible shift in his perception of existence, nah? The insidious movements within the camera's prints escalated, shedding their initial subtlety for a visceral, undeniable brutality, ¿cierto? No longer mere tremors or faint distortions, the captured scenes now writhed with overt violence, each developing image a micro-apocalypse in miniature. Elias discovered a new print depicting a seemingly tranquil cafe interior. Initially, a barista smiled, wiping down a counter. Over the span of an hour, however, the smile contorted into a silent scream. The wiping cloth became a desperate hand pressed against a gushing wound, and the pristine counter shattered, shards of ceramic spraying outward. This wasn't a premonition. It was an active, unfolding horror playing out in agonizing slow motion before his eyes, ¿cierto? The sheer immediacy of these visions, the way they depicted not just an event, but the chilling process of its unfolding, plunged him into a new abyss of terror. The relentless onslaught of these graphic premonitions began to fracture his mental resilience. He started to see the faces from the photographs in the mundane streetscape outside his window. A fleeting glimpse of a woman with a distinctive scarf, then her image manifesting on a newly developed print, her scarf slowly tightening, constricting, until her face turned a sickening blue. He once prided himself on his detachment, his ability to observe without involvement, but the camera now forced involvement upon him, making him a willing voyeur to the world's quiet suffering. The weight of this unsolicited clairvoyance pressed down, suffocating him with a guilt that was both profound and utterly irrational. How could he intervene? What could he possibly say to someone whose fate was already being etched in light and shadow? A particularly grotesque image materialized. A man, seemingly a transient, huddled in a doorway, his face etched with weariness, ¿cierto? As Elias watched, horrified, the man's features began to bloat, his skin taking on a waxy pallor, his eyes clouding over. Then, from beneath his tattered coat, a swarm of insects, tiny and ravenous, began to crawl, emerging from his orifices, consuming him from within. It was a vision of slow, agonizing decay, a biological horror that transcended mere death. This was not just an ending, it was an unmaking. The sheer depravity of this particular vision, its lingering, visceral horror, solidified a terrible certainty within him. He could no longer simply observe, ¿cierto? This was an active malevolence, a force that demanded more than passive witness. Driven by a desperate, gnawing need for understanding, Elias scoured the camera for any clues. He ran his fingers over every inch of its ancient casing, pressing, twisting, searching for hidden compartments. Tucked behind the tarnished brass plate of the lens, barely visible to the naked eye, he found a tiny, almost imperceptible seam. With trembling fingers, he pried it open. Inside, nestled in a velvet-lined recess, was a single, brittle fragment of parchment. It was a ledger entry, written in faded, spidery script, detailing a series of repossessions and transfers of essence attributed to the Ocular of Lamentations, certo? Each entry was accompanied by a name, a date, and a chillingly brief description of their demise, eerily mirroring the camera's grim projections. The dates spanned centuries, hinting at an ancient, cyclical horror. The camera wasn't merely foretelling death, it was intertwined with it, perhaps even orchestrating it. This revelation, stark and terrifying, served as his true crossing of the threshold, né? The camera was no longer a mere object of morbid curiosity. It was an active participant in the fabric of fate, a conduit for something truly malevolent. Elias could no longer retreat into his quiet, solitary existence. The horrors were too vivid, too personal, too undeniably real, certo? The vision of the decaying transient, in particular, had shattered his last vestiges of passive observation. A new resolve, cold and sharp, ignited within him. He would not simply watch as these lives unraveled. He would confront this cursed device, understand its true nature, and perhaps, somehow, break its cycle of torment. Even if it meant embracing the very madness he had so desperately tried to outrun, the alternative, a life spent as a helpless spectator to endless, escalating nightmares, was far more unbearable. His world had irrevocably shifted. The only path forward lay through the heart of the darkness. The camera, an entity now seemingly alive and malevolent, responded to Elias's desperate foray into its history. Its focus sharpened, narrowing from the general currents of human suffering to the specific tributaries of his own life. The images, once depicting strangers in distant corners, now began to feature faces he recognized, individuals he'd merely brushed shoulders with. The stoic barista from his morning coffee ritual, the quiet librarian who always recommended obscure texts, even the elderly woman who walked her terrier past his window each afternoon, certo? This shift was a direct, chilling affront to his carefully constructed isolation, forcing a proximity to the horror he could no longer deny or dismiss. One particular print manifested with agonizing clarity. The librarian, a young woman named Clara, reaching for a heavy, leather-bound tome on the uppermost shelf of the municipal library. As Elias watched, the static image began its slow, sickening animation. Clara's fingers, initially graceful, slipped, her body lurching precariously, certo? Then, in grotesque detail, the vision showed her fall, a sickening trajectory that ended with her neck snapping against the edge of a lower shelf, a silent, yet vividly implied crack echoing in his mind. The sheer visceral immediacy of this unfolding tragedy, rendered with such chilling precision, propelled him into a frenzied, desperate resolve. Driven by an overwhelming, primal urge to intervene, a desperate defiance against the camera's grim prophecy, Elias raced to the library. The horror of this outcome was not merely the death itself, but the agonizing realization that his attempt to defy fate had only twisted it, amplifying the suffering, making the tragedy more personal and more agonizingly his. A profound guilt, cold and corrosive, began to eat away at him. He became convinced that his very awareness, his desperate attempts to tamper with the camera's grim narratives, were the catalysts for this intensified malevolence. The city outside his window seemed to warp into a grotesque reflection of the camera's visions. He saw phantom twitches in the limbs of passers-by, heard faint, premonitory screams in the wind. The line between what the camera showed and what his mind conjured blurred into an indistinguishable nightmare. In a desperate bid for understanding, for some form of absolution, he sought out Professor Aris Thorne, no relation, a reclusive academic known for his esoteric studies of ancient artifacts. Elias, clutching the camera like a cursed talisman, recounted his terrifying experiences, his voice laced with the frantic edge of a man teetering on the brink. He spoke of the living photographs, the ledger, the horrifying interventions. Professor Thorne listened with a detached, clinical interest, his gaze unwavering, but his responses were veiled in polite skepticism, then thinly disguised concern for Elias's mental well-being. He offered abstract theories of advanced psychological stress and the dangers of isolation rather than any concrete assistance. The professor, a potential ally, proved unreliable, his intellectual curiosity outweighed by a rational dismissal of the supernatural, leaving Elias more isolated than ever, his pleas dismissed as the ravings of a madman. His attempts to find external validation for the horror only reinforced his terrifying solitude, pushing him further into the abyss of his own unraveling mind. The world, once a collection of discrete observations for Elias, had transformed into a seamless, terrifying tapestry woven from the threads of premonition and consequence. The initial shiver of unease, a mere discord in the symphony of his solitary life, had swelled into a cacophony of dread, each note resonating with the chilling echo of what was to come, or, more horrifyingly, what had already been irrevocably altered by his touch. His sanctuary, the quiet apartment that had once offered refuge from the clamor of human interaction, now felt like a glass cage, every surface reflecting the distorted visages of looming catastrophe. The very air he breathed seemed thick with the unspoken weight of impending doom, a suffocating presence that pressed against the walls of his sanity, nay? The insidious nature of the camera's influence had undergone a profound metamorphosis.
O que beganas uma espectral glimpso entre os misfortúnios de estranhos havia metastasizado, drawing the circle of its malevolence ever tighter, until its chilling gaze settled upon the very periphery of his own existence. The faces that flickered into grim animation on the developing prints were no longer anonymous figures from a distant, indifferent world, but spectral reflections of those he had briefly encountered, their fates now inextricably linked to his own agonizing awareness. This shift from detached spectator to an unwitting yet deeply implicated participant was perhaps the cruelest twist, forcing him to confront the tangible, agonizing repercussions of a power he neither sought nor understood, A chilling paradox had emerged from the heart of this unfolding nightmare. The very act of knowing, once a pursuit of clarity, had become an unbearable burden. His desperate attempts to sever the threads of fate, to redirect the grim currents of preordained suffering, had merely served to knot them tighter, twisting the inevitable into forms more grotesque and personal, certo? Each intervention, born of a desperate primal urge to preserve, had instead acted as a catalyst, amplifying the suffering, rendering the tragedies more immediate, more visceral. The world, it seemed, was a delicate, interconnected mechanism, and his clumsy, terrified attempts to mend its broken parts only shattered them further, scattering shards of devastation that cut deep, The profound solitude he had always embraced, a self-imposed shield against the complexities of human connection, now felt like a desolate prison, His fractured pleas for understanding, whispered into the void of a skeptical world, had been met with a wall of rational disbelief, isolating him further within the confines of his own terrifying reality. This reinforced his conviction that the burden was uniquely his, a solitary vigil against an ancient, relentless force that defied conventional understanding. The whispers of the past, hinted at by the cryptic ledger, suggested a lineage of suffering, a cyclical horror that stretched back through time, positioning him not merely as a victim, but as the latest, unsuspecting inheritor of a malevolent legacy. As the boundaries between dream and waking dissolved, and the line between premonition and actual event blurred into an indistinguishable haze, a stark realization began to crystallize. The camera was not merely a tool for observation, nor even solely a harbinger of doom. It was rather a living, parasitic entity feeding on the very fabric of despair it helped to weave. Its cold, unblinking lens did not just capture light. It seemed to drink the essence of the unfolding tragedy, growing stronger with each agonizing death it foretold, each life it helped to extinguish. The chilling implication was clear. The horror was not merely happening to him, it was using him, nah? Reflecting on this harrowing journey so far, one cannot escape the creeping certainty that the ultimate confrontation looms, a final, inescapable rendezvous with the source of this pervasive dread, a moment where the full, terrifying scope of its power would finally be unveiled, demanding a sacrifice perhaps far greater than mere sight. The stage was set for a terrifying reckoning, where the only path forward lay through the very heart of the nightmare, towards a truth that promised to be as devastating as it was profound, nah? Elias, a man now hollowed out by relentless dread and suffocating guilt, found his world shrinking to the confines of his apartment, the only space where the horrors of the camera could be contained, albeit imperfectly. He was a prisoner of his own perception, the walls of his sanity steadily eroding under the ceaseless onslaught of the premonitions. The insidious movements within the photographs, once subtle, now accelerated, morphing with terrifying speed.
A new print, one he had not consciously taken, materialized on his developing tray, a stark, unblinking image of his own reflection in a shattered mirror. As he watched, transfixed, the fragments of his mirrored face began to shift, to distort, until his throat, in the chilling tableau, was visibly constricting, turning a ghastly shade of purple, certo? The mirror itself began to crack further, until a single, jagged shard, glinted with a malevolent light, seemed to pierce his throat in the image, a silent scream frozen on his lips. Nah? This was it. The camera, in its ultimate act of cruelty, was now foretelling his death, a brutal, intimate strangulation, a final, inescapable prophecy. A morbid clarity settled over him. The ledger's cryptic entries, the ocular of lamentations, the cyclical nature of the curse, it all coalesced into a single, terrifying truth, nah? The camera did not just predict death, it craved it. It was a parasitic entity, a living void that fed on final breaths, growing stronger, more insatiable with each soul it consumed, certo? And now it demanded his. The only reprieve, the ledger had hinted, the only way to break the cycle, was to offer it the ultimate sacrifice, his own demise. He was to be both the prophet and the final offering. The very thought was a grotesque inversion of his life's purpose, a photographer forced to frame his own end. He prepared, not with resignation, but with a cold, desperate defiance. He would not simply be another statistic in the camera's grim ledger. If his death was the only way to stop this unending horror, then he would meet it on his own terms, nah? He set up the camera, the ancient wood cool and heavy in his trembling hands, positioning it meticulously. The lens, a gaping maw, stared back at him, expectant. He fixed his gaze on his own reflection in the lens, a distorted, terrified visage, but beneath the fear, a flicker of something else, defiance. He would not give it the satisfaction of despair. With a profound, agonizing certainty, he depressed the shutter, the click echoing like a gunshot in the oppressive silence of his apartment. The flash erupted, a blinding white void, momentarily erasing everything, nah? He felt a sudden, crushing pressure around his throat, a searing pain, a sensation of being violently pulled, consumed by an unseen insane force. He gasped, his vision blurring, the room spinning into a vortex of darkness. Yet he did not die. The strangulation, agonizingly real, released its grip. He collapsed to the floor, gasping, clawing at his throat, his body convulsing. The pain slowly receded, leaving him weak, trembling, but undeniably, impossibly alive. He looked up, heart hammering, towards the camera, Certo. It sat there, inert, its lens now dull, lifeless, nah? The vibrant, horrifying dance of premonition had ceased. The ominous hum, the subtle vibration that had permeated his bones was gone. The cursed object was finally quiet. The terror, however, was far from over. He crawled towards the camera, a profound sense of unease settling over him. It was no longer the ocular of lamentations, the harbinger of death. It had changed. The lens, once a gateway to premonition, now seemed to possess a deeper, more chilling emptiness. He raised it, his hands shaking, and pointed it at a small, wilting houseplant on his windowsill. He pressed the shutter, a tentative, almost fearful click. There was no flash, no whirring, nah? He developed the film, his breath hitched in his throat. The print emerged, not of the plant, but of a shimmering, ethereal mist, a faint, almost imperceptible wisp rising from where the plant had been. He looked back at the windowsill, Certo. The plant was gone. Not withered, not dead, but gone. A small, empty pot remained.
A camera in its final, terrifying transformation no longer merely captured light, it harvested souls. His defiance had not broken the curse, but merely transmuted it, creating a no, unspeakable horror. The reprieve was not for him, but for the camera, now endowed with a chilling new power, a bottomless hunger that had only just begun to awaken. The silence that followed the camera's transformation was more terrifying than any scream. Elias stood amidst the wreckage of his apartment, the lingering scent of ozone and fear clinging to the air. The small empty pot on the windowsill was a stark monument to the camera's chilling new appetite, nay? He was alive, yes, a survivor of his own foretold demise, but at what cost? The silence of the camera was not a sign of its defeat, but of its satiation, its evolution. It was no longer a prophet of doom, it was a silent, ravenous predator. His survival was a cruel twist, a victory that tasted of ash and dread. The world outside, once a source of terrifying premonitions, now felt like a vast, unsuspecting field for the camera's new hunt. He pictured it, the ancient device, its lens an empty maw, hungering for the very essence of life, leaving behind only hollow husks. He had thought to break the curse, to avert his own fate, but he had merely redirected the river of malevolence, unleashing a deeper, more insidious horror upon the world, nay? The weight of this new knowledge, this horrifying responsibility, settled upon him like a shroud woven from the shadows of countless unharvested souls. Elias tried to return to some semblance of his former life, but the attempt was a grotesque pantomime. The solitary apartment, once his sanctuary, was now a tomb of lingering dread. Every shadow held a phantom movement. Every quiet creak of the floorboards echoed the silent click of a shutter. He saw the camera everywhere, in the dark corners of his periphery, in the distorted reflections of shop windows. It sat in his dark room, inert and terrifying, a constant reminder of its new chilling power. He could not bring himself to destroy it, nor could he bring himself to use it. It was an object of profound, unholy fascination, a living testament to the fragility of reality and the monstrous depths of the unknown. His mind, once sharp and analytical, was now a fractured landscape of paranoia. He began to see the world through the camera's lens, not with premonition, but with a disturbing awareness of the souls that pulsed beneath the surface of everyday life, vulnerable to the silent harvest. He avoided eye contact, flinched at sudden movements, convinced that any interaction could trigger the camera's hunger, that his mere presence could lead to another unseen consumption, certo? He was a living ghost, haunted by the memory of a plant's quiet disappearance, forever marked by the chilling transformation he had inadvertently wrought. The true horror, he realized, lay not in death, but in the lingering, inescapable dread of an unmade world. The camera, the ocular of lamentations, was no longer a curse to be broken, but a new, terrifying force in the world, a silent, unseen reaper, nen? Elias, the reclusive photographer, was now its unwilling keeper, condemned to live with the knowledge of what he had unleashed. His survival was not a reprieve, but a perpetual torment, a chilling testament to the fact that some horrors, once awakened, merely evolve, their malevolence deepening, their hunger forever insatiable. The world continued, oblivious, but for Elias, every breath was a reminder of the souls that could now be harvested, a silent, chilling promise of the terror that had only just begun. The quiet that settled over Elias's apartment was not the peace of resolution, but the heavy, suffocating silence of a profound transformation.
The camera, once a tormenting prophet of impending doom, now rested inert, its ominous hum finally stilled. Yet, this newfound quiet was far more terrifying than the cacophony of premonitions that had once assaulted his senses. His survival, a moment of defiant triumph over a foretold demise, had merely been a cruel sleight of hand, a redirection of a malevolent force rather than its vanquishing. The plant's silent disappearance, its essence utterly consumed, had been the chilling testament to the camera's evolution, a grotesque metamorphosis from a seer of death into a quiet, insatiable devourer of life itself. Elias walked through his days like a living ghost, burdened by a terrible, singular awareness. The world, once a place of mundane observations and predictable rhythms, was now seen through the lens of an unforgivable truth. He no longer feared the twitch of a limb or the fraying of a rope, for the camera's grim prophecies had ceased. Instead, a deeper, more pervasive dread clung to him. The knowledge that beneath the vibrant surface of everyday existence, an unseen hunger now lurked, capable of extinguishing the very spark of being, leaving behind only an empty vessel. Every passerby, every fleeting smile, every casual gesture carried the chilling potential of an unseen harvest, a silent, unmade void where a soul once resided. His attempts to intervene, born of a desperate, primal urge to preserve life, had not broken the cycle of horror, but had merely twisted it, ushering in a new, more insidious form of malevolence. He had learned, with agonizing clarity, that some destinies are not merely escapable, but are actively amplified by resistance. The curse was not lifted. It had merely shed its skin, evolving into a more profound and existential threat. Certo? The camera, the ocular of lamentations, now sat as a silent sentinel, a chilling reminder of the cosmic balance he had unwittingly disturbed. A void that no longer foretold death, but actively facilitated its most profound and terrifying manifestation, the unmaking of the soul itself, nay? This was the true, enduring horror, not the spectacle of physical demise, but the quiet, unceremonious erasure of consciousness, of memory, of the very essence that defined a living being. Elias was condemned to carry this knowledge, a solitary sentinel in a world oblivious to the silent disappearances now made possible.
His reprieve was not a liberation, but a deeper imprisonment within a reality forever tainted by what he had unleashed. He was the reluctant custodian of an ancient evil, forever marked by the chilling transformation he had inadvertently wrought upon a world that continued to spin, unaware of the new, silent predator in its midst. The ultimate terror, he understood now, lay not in the grand, dramatic confrontations with evil, but in its insidious, pervasive nature, its ability to adapt and consume, leaving behind only the echo of what was. The true vigilance begins now, not against the visible specter of death, but against the quiet, unmade voids in the fabric of existence, against the subtle erosion of what it means to be truly alive. Elias lived, an agonizing testament to the fact that some horrors, once awakened, merely evolve, their malevolence deepening, their hunger forever insatiable, leaving those who survive forever changed, forever haunted by the chilling knowledge of what truly lurks beneath the surface of the mundane. The ultimate terror, he understood now, lay not in the grand, dramatic confrontations with evil, but in its insidious, pervasive nature, its ability to adapt and consume, leaving behind only the echo of what was. The true vigilance begins now, not against the visible specter of death, but against the quiet, unmade voids in the fabric of existence, against the subtle erosion of what it means to be truly alive. Elias lived, an agonizing testament to the fact that some horrors, once awakened, merely evolve, their malevolence deepening, their hunger forever insatiable, leaving those who survive forever changed, forever haunted by the chilling knowledge of what truly lurks beneath the surface of the mundane.